And today's budget comes at a time like no other, a time of great uncertainty and, for many, hardship. COVID-19 has upended and disrupted the lives of us all. Tá muid ag déile leis an caineasta seo ag am ionta ag am anu. Seo am an bhfuil lein neamhcheanteacht agus do go leor am an cruachas. Bhí tinkar COVID-19 gar in lig agus tar síl bod is cin mar gheallar sin. It has impacted people in different ways. Citizens with disabilities face unprecedented challenges, with many at breaking point. Families have seen their incomes drop, and they're worried how they will cover their bills at the end of the month. Our health service, underfunded and mismanaged by Fine Gael for a decade, is under severe pressure like never before. And businesses are fighting for their very survival. This budget needed to respond back to this and the continuing threat posed by Brexit, by protecting workers and families as they face the continued threat of COVID-19. This budget needed to provide certainty that their incomes will not fall off a cliff, certainty that the government will do all it can to protect your job, certainty that our health service has the capacity to weather the storms ahead. This budget has failed to provide that certainty. It repeats a pattern of behaviour that has marked this Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael government since it took power. Indecisive, unprepared, too slow to act, lacking the ambition this moment demands. The government will defend this budget with worn-out excuses. They will say it's all they can afford, that they'll say that they can't tackle the major cracks in our society just at this time, that we must wait. But not only is that not good enough, it's simply not true. A decade ago, taxpayers bailed out the banks to the tune of €64 billion, picking up the pieces after Fianna Fáil torpedoed our economy and wrecked the public finances. Today we had an opportunity to do something very different, to bail out workers, to bail out families at a time of great uncertainty, to seize this moment by permanently increasing capacity in our hospitals and tackling the housing crisis for once and for all, to rebuild an economy that is stronger, that is fairer, that is better. Bhí an disisiú go nniu rudneart difriúil a dhéanamh, le leibh chuidí a chóirta ibranaí ag am a neamhcheanteacht. Le géile gur na tíre seo a thógáil ar bhalla a bhí níos léidre, níos cór agus níos fearr. The risk is not that we do too much, it is that we do too little, and we can see that in the government's plan. Indeed, €6 billion or close to it is unallocated in the government's plan because they don't know what to do. Today, the government should have tackled core areas: unaffordable childcare costs, underfunded disability services, a dysfunctional housing market and a healthcare system that is crying out for significant investment. Failures in these areas by successive governments has undermined our resilience and has limited our ability to combat the virus and weather the storm. Nowhere is this more true than in our health service. Our hospitals and our healthcare staff are under immense pressure. A decade of underfunding, of mismanagement and neglect under Fine Gael has left them in a vulnerable position. And you can't say you weren't warned. As far back as 2009, the recommendations were clear. We had 289 critical care beds. We were told we needed 579 by this year. What do we have today? 280. Instead of increasing beds over a decade of Fine Gael government, we have entered 2020 with less critical care beds than we had a decade ago. And limited capacity in our hospitals has undermined our ability to respond to this virus. So what are you planning to deliver for 2021? 66 ICU beds, we're told, an increase of only 41 on where we are now, because many of these figures that have been announced are double counting, and that is nowhere near enough. The same can be said in relation to acute beds. Many of those beds are already in place. What was needed was real ambition, an additional 100 ICU beds that Sinn Féin had pledged for, an additional 600 more acute beds, bringing the total over 2020's figures of 1,800. That is the type of ambition, that is indeed the type of support that those who rely on that service and our frontline workers and our doctors needed. But they didn't hear from government today. Our plan would have addressed the capacity deficiencies and regional inequalities in access to healthcare. The government plan has not done that. Our health system needed far more. Patients and healthcare workers deserved more. Today was the day to turn fine words and applause into real action. Today was the day that you could have ended the two-tier pay in our public sector. This is the day it could have come to an end. But despite all the fine words from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and indeed the Greens for our nurses and our teachers and our others and public sector workers, they couldn't even find it in themselves to make the resources available to end the pay inequality for our frontline workers. That was the least that they deserve today. Sinn Féin would have taken a different course. We would have expanded and ring-fenced extra cancer care and mental health funding, providing funding for critical care beds and acute care beds that we need, and by recruiting the additional staff, nurses and doctors and allied health professionals so that our hospitals are safely staffed. Today's health budget leaves our patients and our staff vulnerable, and that's the unfortunate reality. As I said in my open remarks, the pandemic has affected our people in different ways. It has affected none more so than citizens with disability, the forgotten people of this pandemic. Today, these citizens needed relief, they needed sanctuary, and what did they get? They got an increase, and I welcome the increase to reopen disability service. And I commend all of those families and providers who worked so hard over the last period to bring this about. It is so long overdue, this funding. That they were left for so long and that they had to fight so hard is an indictment of this government and indeed successive governments. And we need to get to the point where people with disabilities or their families do not have to battle every single time the state and the government for what are their rights. And today, you could have done a lot more, and so more needed to be done. Today has to be only seen as a first step in relation to the supports that those with disabilities and the sector require and are crying out for. Because what we have seen over successive years isn't a vision of a real republic. What we have seen is a vision of people who were vulnerable, who needed support from the state and were left behind and abandoned. COVID-19 has been an earthquake in our economy. In the second quarter of this year, this state suffered the second highest level of job losses across Europe. In September, our unemployment stood at 15%, with more than 1 in 3 of our young people out of work. Its impact has been felt hardest among young people and low-paid workers, and by those who before this crisis were just keeping their heads above water. Workers and families have been facing sky-high rents, unaffordable childcare costs, whose incomes were being squeezed by a high cost of living. Thousands upon thousands have now lost their jobs or seen their incomes slashed. And instead of protecting these workers and families, this government has left them vulnerable. As Minister Michael McGrath was signing off ministerial orders to give super junior ministers a pay rise of over €17,000, his colleagues were across the room putting pen to regulations to cut the pandemic unemployment payment. That shows you how out of touch this government has become only after 100 days in office. To think that somebody on €135,000 was being given €330 per week extra, but yet Cabinet colleagues have said that €350 is too much for people who've had a shock in their income through no fault of their own, have lost their jobs mainly because of health restrictions that have been imposed by this government. It is wrong, and the pandemic unemployment payment should be reversed, that cut, and it should be brought to the level of €350 as a top rate. Today, the government has made those cuts permanent, with thousands set to see their income cut by more than 40% as a result of this budget. Sinn Féin would have given certainty to these workers and families. These are people who wonder how they're going to make it through 2021 without work. We would have reversed the cut to the pandemic unemployment payment. We would have ensured that the cut that you plan on the 1st of February wouldn't go ahead. We would bring the top rate back to €350 and ensure that households don't see their incomes fall off a cliff as a result of the pandemic, but instead are supported, instead are protected, instead are coveted during this challenging period. For too many, pensioners are seeing their weekly fixed incomes eroded as a result of the cost of living crisis. You decided today in your budget to leave thousands of them with no relief in your budget, with no increase in the weekly pension payment, not even a single euro. Sinn Féin would have increased the pension for all and to €5 for those living alone. This is a government that is out of touch, unable to fathom the reality of life for those who rely on state pensions just to get by. Your reluctant decision today, forced by Sinn Féin, may I add, to suspend the increase in the state pension from 66 to 67 is simply not good enough. You say you won't even give pensioners certain that they'll be able to retire at the age of 66. You say we'll have to do a report, we'll look at it, we'll push it down the road, and it may go back up to 67 next year. But that is no good. People need certainty, and what they need certainty isn't on 67 or 66. People should be able to retire at the age of 65 and be able to draw a state pension at that time. That is Sinn Féin's position. We will accept nothing less. Ten ceart a gibrinní Irias agus pension a beacu ag ís seasca cuig, ní lachan le Sinn Féin le a dhéith ní slú na seo. Instead, what we have is a situation under Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens where thousands of 65-year-olds have been forced onto job seekers' payments after a lifetime of work. And when it comes to the most vulnerable people across the state, families on their knees financially, households depending on social welfare, you saw fit to ignore them. You just forgot about them. You could have acted on our proposal. The Sinn Féin's budget proposal would have delivered a €5 across-the-board increase and a €10 for people with disabilities. As your government has made cuts to the pandemic unemployment payment irreversible, you have ploughed ahead with a 29% increase in carbon tax, a measure that is recognised by the Department of Finance as being regressive, hitting poor households, rural households and single parents families the hardest. It will not change their behaviour. It's very clear in that. All it's going to do is make them poor. And combined with an increase in electricity PSO and price hikes from energy providers, this isn't the just transition that we were promised. At the same time, what you've done is you've hiked up motor tax on older petrol and diesel cars. Now, Sinn Féin believes that a transition to electric cars is an essential step in moving forward to a greener and cleaner economy. But this increase in motor tax will only affect those who can least afford a tax hike. And those in rural areas who, due to underfunding in rural transport, are heavily dependent on the car. Coupled with changes in VRT, these decisions will disproportionately benefit wealthy drivers while punishing those who cannot afford electric vehicles at this time. This is not the carrot and stick approach. This is the stick approach, and it is the wrong approach. With bills piling up and mortgage payments and rents due to the banks or to the landlord, families face the threat of increased household debt. They needed relief. They could have got relief in this budget. Time and time again, I've called out the price gouging of the insurance industry and the banks. The ban on dual pricing and the unjustified charging of additional interest rate on mortgage breaks, that should never have happened. If there was ever a time for a zero-policy approach to price gouging by insurance companies, banks and energy providers, today was the day to announce it. But time and time again, the government has done nothing. They've actually done worse. They've sided with those big industry, those vested interests, as opposed to ordinary people. And that was evident from your failure to protect mortgage holders impacted during this pandemic, with banks charging additional interest rate during the emergency break period. While other governments across Europe acted, they even brought in legislation to defend their citizens. You and your government gave banks a free ride once again. At the same time, you continue to allow loan sharks to hit struggling families with interest rates as high as 187% of APR. The cost of living has already cut through families' incomes before this pandemic. COVID-19 and government inaction has made that cost of living even sharper. Today, my view was this was the day that we could have turned a new leaf. We could have tackled this head-on, especially in the area of childcare, where parents are paying amongst the highest costs right across Europe. Sinn Féin's policies would have cut the cost of childcare next year by 1/3 and could do the same again the following year. And immediately what we would have done was increased the pay of our childcare workers to the living wage. It is the least that they deserve. Instead, the government has completely ignored this sector. The pandemic has exposed the market failures to measure the real value of work and care in our society. Those once labelled as unskilled were recognised as essential, and rightly so. For Sinn Féin, Those frontline workers are on our shop floors, they're in our care homes, in our childcare facilities, our cleaners, our hospitality workers, and many, many more. They have always been essential workers, and for far too long they've been undervalued. Essential workers are more likely to be found working in our care homes and our shop floors than in the boardrooms of banks or investment companies. But despite this, vested interests have always had access to the corridors of powers over ordinary people and their representatives. And if we needed proof, we only have to look at what happened last month, when the former Fine Gael minister, who left the Department of Finance in June, took up a post as the CEO for the financial lobby group 3 months later, a group that lobbied that same minister to extend the Special Assignee Relief Programme, a little unknown tax relief that allows some of the highest income earners in the state, who earn up to €1 million salary, to reduce their personal income tax by €111,000, reducing their tax rate to 28% when every Tom, Dick and Harry and Sheila pay 40% of tax. And are we surprised that the government has extended that break today in this budget? Not at all, because that's what they do. Maybe one of them is auditioning for a new role in one of the lobby groups. They already, in Fine Gael, hold the CEO of the bankers and the funds. Maybe one of them is thinking of going into insurance in the future. The reality is you need to compare this with what is happening in relation to how they treat low-income paid employees. A miserly increase in the minimum wage of 10 cents. How mean-spirited could you be? 10 cents, 1% of an increase at a time when so many people are under pressure. What message does this send to those people who are doing such essential services? I'll tell you what message it is. It is a message of contempt. Tishbin and pandem seo dún ho táhairte agus a tena hebrani riachtainna. Tishbin and Oireachtas and muhas tíbhasin agus erdu 10 cent tucha a níos faie is mosla isho. Jobs lost as a result of the public health measures have been concentrated among low-paid workers. This is especially seen in the areas of hospitality, in retail and in tourism. These workers and small businesses have struggled with rolling closures and reduced trading activity. And if we're to protect our economy, we must ensure that as many jobs and businesses are saved. To that end, wage supports are absolutely crucial. On the 1st of September, the government introduced its employment wage subsidy scheme. It's a scheme that's not fit for purpose. It's a scheme that locks out 150,000 low-income workers where their employer gets no support whatsoever because their employees earn below €151.50. It's a scheme that's seen the supports to employers nearly cut by 50%, now with the highest subsidy available at €203 per week. It covers as little as 35% of weekly wages for workers in sectors who are struggling to survive. Today, you've extended that scheme, a scheme that fails to meet the needs of struggling businesses, with no plans to increase the level of wage supports for those most highly impacted sectors. It is a scheme that will increase unemployment in the months ahead unless it is changed. Sinn Féin's proposed wage subsidy scheme would have provided the necessary level of wage support and targeted supports at highly impacted sectors by guaranteeing 85% of take-home pay for workers on the minimum wage, with wage subsidies of up to €410 per week for highly impacted sectors and €300 per week for those sectors that are moderately impacted by the pandemic. This would have saved jobs. It would have supported struggling businesses. It would have reduced the numbers of people in receipt of social welfare payments in the future. It made good economic sense. What the government has announced today fails to do that. What are small and medium-sized businesses needed? Those businesses that employ over 1 million people with certainty. Not certainty that they'll all survive, because no government can provide that type of level of certainty. But they needed certainty that they had a government on their side, a government that would do everything in their power to ensure that they had the best chance of survival. People who were working in those companies needed to know that they had a government that would do everything that they could to make sure that their job was secure. But that hasn't been done today, creating huge uncertainty for businesses and their employees right throughout the state. Since the onset of the crisis, the government's response to small businesses has been one of delay. Our small businesses and their workers have suffered as a result of this delay. Take, for example, the Taoiseach's flagship project, the Credit Guarantee Scheme, which the Government have talked up since the crisis. It's €2 billion of financial lifeline to struggling businesses, a scheme that got up and running 5 months after better schemes were introduced in Germany and Britain and elsewhere. €2 billion the Government boasts. Up until today, only 128 loans have been approved with a total value of €6 million. Not €2 billion, €6 million 6 months into this pandemic. Less than 3% of funding available under the scheme 6 months into the crisis. This delay is damaging businesses. It's costing jobs. It is a delay that has been characterised other chaotic or other policy choices of the Government. Today, the Government finally adopted Sinn Féin's proposal to reduce the VAT rate from 13.5% to 9% for the hospitality and tourism sector. We welcome that. It is a support that comes late in the day and should have been introduced in our view since the summer. They have failed to provide a grant support package for businesses that face the threat of closure as a result of public health restrictions. Instead, they have introduced a compensation scheme that will run out at the end of March. The support is contingent, insufficient and time-limited. And this pandemic, we know, isn't going to end in March, unfortunately. The reality is, unless they allow for these allowances to be carried or to be claimed twice, this isn't grant aid. It's just an issue that will assist businesses in terms of cash flow. Even though that's welcome, what we need is significant grant support for these businesses. What they needed was not a contingency or a maybe. They needed a guarantee. And we can see that over the budget. Huge amounts of figures that will bamboozle you. But nearly €6 billion of it is unallocated. The Government, even at this stage, doesn't know the supports that were needed for businesses. Businesses are making decisions right here, right now, whether they will keep going or whether they will give up. And they needed a level of certainty. They needed to hear, we're going to ramp up the wage subsidy scheme because we got it wrong. The pandemic is going to be with us for longer. We need to support you and the jobs you create. They needed to hear that they were going to deliver cash injections to businesses to make sure that they could deal with their overheads, not just issues in terms of cash flow. That's the type of guarantee that could have been provided to businesses but wasn't done. Sinn Féin would have acted differently, implementing a support package that our small businesses could rely on throughout 2021 to compensate for the cost of any future restrictions. It would guarantee €25,000 and €12,000 in support grants for affected businesses for the duration of 2021. The Government have given no commitment to provide a commercial rates waiver. This is just startling. No rates waiver in 2021. All they're doing is extend it for another 3 months of this year. That's just simply doesn't cut it. What should have been done is a further 6 months waiver into 2021, again giving certainty to these businesses who have been so badly affected. And what you should have done is rolled out a tourism and hospitality voucher, €200 per adult, €100 per child, which would boost demand, increase trading and support balance sheets for small businesses in the hospitality and tourism sector, instead of the dog's dinner of a scheme that you've done in terms of the Stay and Spend initiative, which simply won't cut it. These stimulus measures that I've outlined would have increased the chances of firm survival and so, therefore, the survival of jobs. With cuts to wage supports now confirmed into next year and no certainty of grant support for businesses that are struggling as a result of public health restrictions, the Government is going to lead us into a winter's jobs crisis. Today was an opportunity not only to protect jobs but actually to create jobs. A decade of Fine Gael in power created a housing crisis that hasn't gone away. Road networks, rail and infrastructure that is in desperate need of upgrading and connecting our regions and communities. Now was the time to significantly increase public investment. At a time of historically low interest rates, even the IMF are calling out on advanced economies to ramp up capital expenditure through sustainable borrowing. And we would have seized this opportunity. We would have increased capital investment by an additional €2.5 billion. What the Government have done is announce €600 million extra on capital investment. It's a paltry figure when we look at the need to stimulate the economy and the needs in other areas, particularly in housing. Our package would in itself create 26,000 jobs, investing in our regions, upgrading our transport network, delivering the biggest public housing programme in the history of the state. This investment was no more needed than in the housing market. Despite a demand for change by the people in the election in February, this government is determined to continue with the failed housing policy of the past. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael created a housing crisis that has locked a generation out of secure and affordable housing accommodation, that saw rents increase by more than 31% since 2016, and that has the largest increase in homelessness in the history of the state. Renters continue to hand a third of their pay package over to their landlords on a monthly basis, and families and couples are struggling to find a home that they simply can't afford. And we were told that this government, now that we have a Fianna Fáil housing minister, that things were going to be different, that they were going to tackle the housing crisis. But today it's very clear that this crisis will remain with us for as long as this government is in power. At the party's conference, the Taoiseach and leader of Fine Gael said that Fianna Fáil was a party with no ideas, no policies and no alternatives. That was true then and is definitely true today. Because where are their big ideas? Where are their big ideas? It is to extend the Help to Buy scheme, a scheme that will push up prices of homes for first-time buyers. Since it was introduced, over 40% of people who availed of the scheme already had the required deposit to secure a mortgage. And this isn't an affordable housing scheme, it's a sop to developers. It doesn't encourage them to reduce house prices, it actually encourages them to increase house prices. That's the reality, and the government know it. Today the government have decided they want to pump more money into this scheme and therefore into the pockets of developers. And this is the best that Fianna Fáil have managed to come up with after being out of government for a decade. It would be embarrassing if the stakes weren't as high. This is the affordable housing plan that Minister Darragh O'Brien has been planning for 4 years. He will try to explain in whatever way he does, but the reality is he needs to try again, and he needs to try a hell of a lot harder. Our broken housing system was exposed by this pandemic. Not only should this budget have been a radical departure of the failed policies of the past, it should have provided immediate protections for renters who are vulnerable in the present. The Minister's first act in housing was to actually strip away the protection that renters had from eviction during this time of great uncertainty. Shame on him. And what has he delivered today? Just £110 million in funding that has been provided for affordable housing. This is to fund an, as of yet, undecided shared equity loan scheme and 400 cost rental homes. The government hasn't even seen fit to invest such a paltry sum into genuinely affordable working homes for working people, and that speaks volumes that that's the level of injection that they're talking about. So much for a Minister for Housing who made so many promises to deliver genuinely affordable homes to working people to rent and to buy. But even worse, it gets worse. The Minister has secured funding for just 593 real social homes, above what is already committed to in 2021. This is an insult to the thousands of homeless families and tens of thousands of people languishing on local authority waiting lists. Will rents decrease under this government? No. Will rents be frozen under this government? No. Things could have been done differently. This was the time to reduce rents by a refundable tax credit. It was the time to freeze rents and give people certainty. It was a time to build the largest public housing building programme in the history of the state, delivering 20,000 social, affordable and cost rental units in 2021. But again, this government has failed to act. At a time of great uncertainty for workers and families, the budget needed to respond back by protecting them, by giving them certainty. Certainty that their incomes would be supported. Certainty that government would do all it could to protect jobs and businesses. Certainty that our hospitals and healthcare workers would be equipped to weather the storms and the challenges ahead. This government has failed to provide that certainty. It is a government that has cut the pandemic unemployment payment, that has slashed supports under the wage subsidy scheme, that has removed the ban of evictions for renters, that has failed to secure the extension for mortgage breaks without additional interest being charged, that has failed to give certainties to struggling businesses and their workers. It needed to provide them with support that they could be relied upon to help weather the storm, not as a maybe, but as a guarantee. by introducing a wage subsidy scheme that was fit for purpose, by introducing grants of 25,000 and 12,000 that would be delivered, not as a contingency, not as a maybe, but it is a certainty. Certain support for businesses, for employers and for the workers. Failure to do this has heightened the risk of job losses and permanent business closures. While no one could have predicted this pandemic, our public services were ill-equipped and under-resourced after decades of neglect under Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. That neglect has left our hospitals, our healthcare workers and our patients vulnerable. This government has failed to address this neglect. It has failed to step up to the challenge. It has failed to deliver on the ambition and the new direction that is needed. It has fallen back on the tired, failed policies of the past. This isn't the budget that Sinn Féin would have delivered. Sinn Féin would have provided certainty to workers and the families. Where we needed ambition and vision, we got more of the same. Papering over the cracks, trying to limp on. It simply isn't good enough for the times that we are in. Today was the time to give certainty. Today was the time to set out a new path to rebuild our economy in a fairer, stronger and better way. Unfortunately, this government, predictably, has failed to deliver that and failed to give certainty.